This is the JTV Caribbean News. I am Sean Rose. Financial institutions across the Bahamas were on high alert this past week as they scrambled to protect the funds of thousands of consumers whose credit cards were compromised by a major data breach. Unconfirmed media reports point to the theft of a data tape from an international data acquiring company based in Barbados as the source of the breach. According to The Guardian, Visa and MasterCard credit cards were impacted, prompting banks in the Bahamas to reissue thousands of cards. Paul McQueenie, managing director at the Bank of the Bahamas, says the bank will replace at least 2,000 credit cards as a defensive measure. Commonwealth Bank Limited confirmed it could reissue as many as 5,000 replacement cards. This latest incident comes shortly after the Bahamas was featured on a list of nations being used as a base of operation by hackers. According to a global research team from WebSense Inc., a leader in internet security, the Bahamas is ranked second among the top 5 countries in the world which host phishing sites. Phishing is an act of fraud in which persons fall victim to websites masquerading as trustworthy sites. The report said that organizations face an average of 1,719 attacks for every 1,000 users. The Bahamas was the only Caribbean nation on the list. The UK's Overseas Territories Minister has given in to pressure from the elected officials in the Turks and Caicos Islands not to introduce VAT in that country. Mark Simmons wrote to both Premier Dr. Rufus Ewing and Opposition Leader Charlene Cartwright Robinson, stating that he would instruct the local governor not to sign the order which would have introduced the sales tax to the territory on April 1. However, Simmons made it clear that the new government will need to find money from somewhere to produce surplus budgets and find its own way to replace the loan guarantee from the UK by 2016. Simmons said it is the Turks and Caicos government that would be held accountable for the country's finances, and he was not about to allow a reversal of the progress made by the previous UK-led interim government. He said that to prevent that reversal, the TCI government would face more difficult choices to ensure stable and sustainable revenues and expenditures in the absence of VAT. The British minister also criticized the local politicians for the use of a private member's bill to overturn the VAT legislation. He said that he would not allow the governor to assent to that bill, but instead he would be directed not to sign the order on the VAT legislation, which would prevent the sales tax from being implemented. Cuban President Raul Castro has announced that he will step down from power after his second term ends in 2018, and the new parliament named a 52-year-old rising star to become his first vice president and most visible successor. "This will be my last term," Castro, 81, said shortly after the National Assembly elected him to a second 5-year tenure. In a surprise move, the new parliament also named Miguel Diaz-Canel as the first vice president, meaning he would take over if Castro cannot serve his full term. Diaz-Canel is a member of the political bureau who rose through the communist ranks in the provinces to become the most visible possible successor to Castro. Raul Castro starts his second term immediately, leaving him free to retire in 2018 at around age 86. Former President Fidel Castro joined the National Assembly meeting in a rare public appearance since falling ill in 2006 and ceding the presidency to his brother Raul. The new government will almost certainly be the last headed up by the Castro brothers and their generation of leaders who have ruled Cuba since they swept down from the mountains in the 1959 revolution that removed Batista. In an address to the nation on Wednesday night, St. Lucia Prime Minister Dr. Kenny Anthony rejected demands by the Trade Union Federation for pay increases greater than the 4% increase in wages already offered by the government, coupled with agreed allowances. Winston Springer Jr. has this report from HTS News Force.
Ladies and gentlemen,
in the televised address to the nation Wednesday night, the Prime Minister argues the cost of the public servants' wage increase would be fiscally ruinous, with a debt-to-GDP ratio at 78% and a fiscal deficit of 10.7% of GDP. The Prime Minister says the government of St. Lucia cannot and will not go further than the 4% increase in wages it has offered.
For the government, the option is clear. It's either wage restraint or retrenchment.
This 4% increase, he says, will cost the government of St. Lucia $22.3 million in back pay for the period April 2010 to March 2013. According to Dr. Anthony, the annual increase will add approximately $13 million to the base of the personal emoluments and wages received by public servants.
It therefore means that the government of St. Lucia will have to borrow an additional $42 million to settle wage negotiations. This includes back pay of $22.2 million, salary increases of $12.7 million, and allowances of $7.2 million. This amount is separate and apart from that which is necessary for financing the 2013-2014 budget.
The Prime Minister warns the 4% hike will worsen the island's fiscal position and will not spur economic growth, job creation, or encourage fiscal consolidation. He warns of sacrifices by all St. Lucians given inevitable spending cuts to address unsustainable debt and fiscal deficits due to the accumulation of borrowing to meet recurrent expenditure, including the public sector wage bill.
We will have to curtail spending in other areas, inclusive of subsidies, to reduce the impact of the settlement. Otherwise, our borrowing will quickly shoot up. This borrowing is like throwing water onto an already sinking ship.
Dr. Anthony believes the parties in the prolonged wage negotiations have arrived at an impasse and has suggested the matter be resolved by arbitration. The Prime Minister vows the government would abide by the decision of a proposed arbitration panel. Winston Springer Jr., HGS News Force.
If the U.S. Congress fails to prevent sequestration, defined as an automatic application of uniform spending reductions to enforce stringent budget goals, the USVI stands to lose more than $100 million in federal funding by fiscal year 2021. Governor John DeYoung said on Thursday that a Bureau of Economic Research study tabulating the negative impact of the upcoming federal sequestration budget cuts on the Virgin Islands provides more evidence that Congress should avert the plan. Earlier this year, the U.S. sequestration plan was modified as part of the American Taxpayer Relief Act of 2012, a bargain to avoid the so-called fiscal cliff. The broad federal spending cuts are now set to go into effect on March 1, and they will immediately impact the U.S. Virgin Islands. The sequestration cuts will hamper ongoing economic recovery efforts in the territory by reducing federal grant spending by well over $10 million annually. Those cuts will take their toll on education, human services, and the transportation systems almost immediately and will continue to negatively impact the territory for many years to come. For the JTV Caribbean News, I'm Sean Rose.
And still to come on JTV News. A policy with possible solutions to the issue of child support is before a cabinet. Minister Walwyn proposes a post-primary concept to help older primary students transition into the next level of education. Lyons governor says a compromise is needed to help bridge generation gap. And contestants give much to tease and please in a sizzling Miss Gorgeous show.